Arthur naturally liked quiet, which was the main reason he was drawn to his job at the city's large old library, where for 12 straight years he had been the sole overnight security guard, serving as a silent watcher for 3 floors of resting books. His shift ran from 9 p.m., just as the last librarians left, until 5 a.m., precisely as the first bakers across the square began their day. He loved the building, especially the way moonlight shone through the main reading room's arched ceiling to cast silver stripes on the oak tables, and he also loved the smell of floor wax old paper and the leather polish he dutifully applied to the armchairs every Tuesday. Although it was busy with students by day, at night the library felt like a giant, empty church, making Arthur feel as though he were its only congregant. His tasks were simple, requiring only that he walk a specific path every 2 hours, which took him up the marble staircase through history, across the mid-level floor, down the twisting iron stairs to science, and finally back to the front desk. The building itself had its own noises, such as the groans of settling, and the hiss of old heaters, all of which Arthur had come to accept as the library's comforting heartbeat. But there was one part of the building not on his route, a part he actively stayed away from, which was the East Annex, built in the 1880s as the original library but long since swallowed by the new construction. Now just storage, it had become a 3-story maze of cramped rooms packed with unlisted donations, forgotten furniture, and the sour-smelling records of defunct city offices. The annex was closed to everyone and accessible only by a steel fire door in the 20th century fiction section, and while the staff joked it was haunted, Arthur just felt it was wrong. The air back there was heavy, still, and cold regardless of the season, so whenever he passed the door on his rounds, a strange tingling would crawl up his arms, an unease that only faded an aisle away. He never went in, simply because he didn't need to. One late November night, as a strong wind scratched at the windows while Arthur was reading at the front desk, the inside phone suddenly buzzed, the sound seeming violent in the silence. He jumped before he answered. Finding it was Ms. Vance, the head librarian, who sounded upset. She apologized, explaining she had received a call from the city because the storm had knocked out power in the West End, causing the city building's emergency system to fail. Arthur was confused, replying, "Okay, ma'am, but everything is fine here, as all the lights are on." "I know," she replied, "but that building holds the city's main record books, and with the power out, the rooms are almost certainly flooding, which means they need the backup records. And Arthur, those backups are in the annex." A cold, tight feeling grew in Arthur's stomach as he repeated, "The annex, ma'am?" "I'm afraid so," she said, explaining. "They're sending a courier who will be there in 30 minutes, so we have to get the boxes ready." Ms. Vance said she'd guide him via an old map, telling him he needed the master key from the lockbox to go to the annex's 2nd floor, and find room 2B, where inside there should be 3 gray metal trunks labeled Municipal Archives, Backup. "Room 2B, Arthur repeated, his voice empty, to which she replied, "Yes, and Arthur?" "Take the heavy-duty flashlight because the wiring in there is terrible, and I'm so sorry to ask this." The line clicked, and Arthur sat for a full minute with the phone humming while the wind howled, sounding for the first time like a warning. But he was a man who did his job, so he hung up, went to the lockbox, and took out the flashlight and the heavy, old-fashioned iron key labeled for the annex. His footsteps echoed loudly as he walked to the steel door, where he turned the key, causing the door to groan open and release a puff of cold air smelling of dust and old ink. He stepped inside, and the door shut behind him with a heavy, final thud, leaving him in a narrow hallway where the air was immediately cold and his flashlight cut a circle in the darkness. He flipped a switch, but only 2 ceiling lights flickered on, casting a sick, yellow glow over a place of bare concrete and exposed pipes. He found the stairs, which were a tight, windowless tube, and as he climbed, his steps seemed to make no sound, as if the very walls were absorbing the noise. On the 2nd-floor landing, he entered a long hallway lined with shelves that were all covered in large canvas sheets, making them look like tall, spooky figures in the dim light. Room 2B was at the far end, so he began walking with his flashlight bouncing, trying to ignore the shapes at the edge of his vision. He tried to whistle, but his mouth was too dry, and just as he passed a tall, sheet-covered stack of chairs, he heard it, a soft sk-sk scrape. He stopped, shining his light on the stack where the sheet was still, and whispered, "Just the building settling." He told himself it was the wind, though he knew there were no windows, so he shook his head and walked on until he reached room 2B. The door was unlocked, and inside the large room he felt a huge sense of relief when he saw the 3 gray metal trunks against the far wall. He crossed the room, read the labels, and bent to pull the first trunk, but as he stood up, he froze. From the hallway he heard a clear, sharp thump that was definitely not pipes, but rather the exact sound of a heavy book hitting the concrete floor. Arthur stood still with his heart like a fist in his chest, holding his breath as the silence that followed felt worse than the noise. He shined his light into the hall, his voice thin as he called, "Hello?" But there was no answer, just the low buzz of old wiring. "A rat," he told himself, turning back to the trunks, but as he grabbed the second one, its metallic screech making him cringe, he immediately heard it again, only closer this time. It was a soft, sliding noise, exactly like a canvas sheet being slowly, purposefully dragged across the floor. He spun, his flashlight beam wobbling as he demanded with a shaking voice, "Who's there?" The sliding stopped, and he stood in the doorway, knuckles white on the flashlight, heart hammering, lying, "I'm calling the police," while not moving. He waited 1 minute, then 2, while the silence grew suffocating, until finally he let out a shaky breath, deciding he was just scaring himself. He turned, grabbed the trunks, and began dragging them one by one into the hall, deliberately keeping his back to the wall as he started pulling the first trunk toward the stairs. That's when he saw that 20 feet away, the canvas sheet covering the chairs was different, bunched in a pool on the floor. Arthur knew with a certainty that turned his blood to ice that it had been perfectly in place when he'd passed. As he watched, a dark, damp stain began to spread on the concrete, seeping from under the sheet with a drip, drip sound. He shined his light up, but the pipes were dry, meaning the liquid was coming from under the sheet, and a new smell hit him, sharp and metallic like rust. He backed up slowly, still pulling the trunk. A scrape sound came from right behind him, causing him to whip around and drop the trunk handle with a deafening crash. He found himself at the stairwell, where the door he had left wide open was now almost closed, leaving only a 6-inch sliver of blackness. He knew he hadn't touched it, and as he stared at the crack he felt a cold presence on the other side, just before a voice whispered his name. "Arthur." The voice whispering his name was a dry, scratching sound, like dead leaves scraping pavement, which made him scream, a short sound the dead air swallowed. He abandoned the trunks and ran down the hallway, away from the stairs and back toward room 2B, which he knew was a dead end. But he couldn't go near that door. He fumbled for his radio, shouting, "Base, this is Arthur. I have an intruder in the East Annex. I repeat." But his flashlight flickered and died, plunging him into near-total darkness, save for the 2 weak bulbs far down the hall. In that terrible dark, the scraping sound returned, only now it was fast and seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the rooms, the shelves, and the ceiling, like 1,000 things scurrying toward him. He ran blind with his hands out, slamming hard into a wall, at which point the flashlight flickered back on, its beam pointing at the floor. He saw the dark, wet stain was at his feet, and in fact, was everywhere, seeping from under every door. The stairwell door banged open, and Arthur ran, splashing through the liquid with his lungs burning until he reached the main fire door. He grabbed for the lock, only to realize with horror that the key was still on the other side. He was trapped, so he turned, pressing his back to the steel door, and raised the flashlight. The hallway was empty, the sounds had stopped, the liquid was gone, and the canvas sheet on the chairs was perfectly back in place, as if everything was exactly as he had first found it. He stood panting, sweat and tears blurring his vision, wondering if he had imagined it. Slowly he walked back, finding the stairwell door open just as he'd left it, and the 3 trunks sat in the hall where he had dropped them. He stood for a long time, the silence pressing in, and then he saw it. On the handle of the 3rd trunk was a single, long, wet smear, and in the middle of it, pressed into the grime, was a perfect 5-fingered handprint, except the fingers were far too long, and the thumb was on the wrong side. He did not take the trunks, but instead walked calmly back to the fire door, stepped into the warm light of the fiction section, and locked the door, leaving the key in it. When the courier arrived, Arthur met him at the front and said the maps were wrong and the items weren't there, after which he sat at his desk until 5 a.m., not reading, just staring at the door. He quit the next day for personal health reasons, never telling Ms. Vance or anyone else what had happened. He found a new job with the Parks Department working in the daylight, but even years later, Arthur cannot be in a quiet room, cannot stand the smell of old paper, and will not under any circumstances enter a building at night.